Chapter 1. It was a mild afternoon in late September, the kind of day where the leaves seemed reluctant to fall, and the village of Lockwood remained wrapped in a golden hush. The annual harvest fete was in full swing upon the green, where bunting flapped lazily, and tea was poured into bone china with a steadiness that suggested centuries of practice. Children ran between the stalls with sticky fingers and flushed cheeks, while the older residents settled into their accustomed roles, judging, observing, gossiping. At a table set a little apart, beneath a parasol that had seen better days, sat Miss Jane Marple. Her blue eyes, faded as a robin's egg, moved gently over the scene. She did not speak much. She rarely did at these sorts of gatherings, but there was a watchfulness about her, a quiet attention that seemed to absorb everything without comment. She had been invited, of course, by virtue of her long-standing friendship with Mrs. Emily Fanshawe, the chairwoman of the Fete Committee, and a woman who believed resolutely that Lockwood's traditions were all that stood between civilization and ruin. Beside Mrs. Fanshawe, fussing with a tin of raffle tickets, sat Reverend Pritchard's wife, whose bonnet suggested piety, but whose sharp glances betrayed a more secular interest in the behavior of others. "I do hope," Mrs. Fanshawe was saying, "that Mr. Clement's bridge speech will not drag on this year. Last time he spoke for nearly half an hour about the importance of rural crossings." Miss Marple smiled. "Well, one does admire his dedication, though I believe everyone is really waiting to see who wins the cake competition." The covered bridge in question, Lockwood's small but fiercely defended landmark, could be glimpsed from the far end of the green, its timber frame arching quaintly over the slow-moving river. It had been freshly painted this summer, though already a smear of mud marred one side where some child had kicked a football astray. This was the site of Mr. Clement's annual address, a tradition as enduring as the fete itself. "There's something quite tragic about bridges," murmured Reverend Pritchard's wife unexpectedly, stirring her tea without looking up. "So many stories begin or end with a crossing." Mrs. Fanshawe tutted. "Really, Margaret, how morbid." Miss Marple said nothing. She was watching the people as they moved between stalls. There was Major Halberton, ruddy-faced and loud as ever, boasting of his tomatoes to anyone who could not escape. Beside him, his daughter Ivy lingered in polite misery, her eyes drifting repeatedly toward the cake tent, or perhaps to the young man loitering near it. James Pettigrew, the schoolmaster's nephew, newly returned from London with an air of slight condescension and rumpled charm. Near the coconut shy, Mrs. Edith Vowles rearranged her hat with nervous fingers. She had been the village's postmistress for 2 decades, and had recently announced her retirement, though some whispered that her health, or perhaps her marriage, had prompted the decision. Her husband, a large man with a slow temper and slower speech, hovered close by with a watchful expression that did not seem wholly devoted to the game. It was all terribly ordinary. And yet, Miss Marple, who had observed human nature for far too long to believe in true peace beneath the bunting, felt that faint stirring of unease. Something was out of place, not openly. There were no arguments, no broken glasses, no sobbing fits and corners. But there were glances exchanged too quickly, silences stretched just too long. A thread pulled taut beneath the calm. "Are you quite well, Miss Marple?" Mrs. Fanshawe inquired, noting her companion's quiet. "Oh, yes, dear Emily. Only thinking how curious it is, how people prepare their faces for public view, like polishing a window. You see the surface, but you never quite know what's stored away behind it. Mrs. Fanshawe, missing the nuance, nodded briskly. Quite so, and some keep very untidy cupboards, if you take my meaning. At 3:30 precisely, the bell from St. Mildred's Church pealed once, a signal not for prayer but for gathering. Mr. Clement, dignified in his grey suit, mounted the small dais erected beside the bridge. A hush fell, broken only by the fidgeting of children and the distant low of cows beyond the hedgerow. My friends, Mr. Clement began, it gives me great pleasure to open this year's fete, and to remind you all of the bridge that links our past to our future. Miss Marple's attention, while politely fixed on the speaker, remained attuned to the people rather than the words. Ivy Halberton chewing her lip, James Pettigrew looking anywhere but at her, Mrs. Vholes twisting her handkerchief, Mr. Vholes, eyes narrow beneath his hat's brim. Something would happen. Not today, perhaps not even tomorrow, but soon it always did, and when it did, Miss Marple would be ready. Chapter 2. Evening settled over Lockwood with the slow certainty of a curtain falling. The fete wound down with a weariness familiar to all who had endured its cheery traditions year after year. Bunting was folded, raffle prizes distributed, and the last sponge cake slices wrapped in wax paper for safekeeping. Laughter thinned into murmured farewells. Miss Marple lingered a little, bidding polite goodbyes beneath the darkening sky. She took no particular pleasure in watching dusk creep over the fields, but she understood its rhythm well enough. People, when tired and unwatched, revealed themselves in small, careless ways. At the covered bridge, Mr. Clement and Major Halberton conferred over something to do with maintenance funds and timber quality. The Major's voice, always prone to volume, carried in snatches. Rot in the beams, blasted nonsense. If we're to preserve it, Clement, there'll be no end of expense, mark my words. Miss Marple turned away discreetly. One didn't need to overhear every detail to know how men like Halberton enjoyed sounding important. The bridge itself looked peaceful in the failing light. Beyond it, the river barely stirred, and a mist curled faintly along the edges where reeds whispered to one another. The villagers avoided crossing it after dark, where reeds whispered to one another. The villagers avoided crossing it after dark, not out of fear exactly, but tradition. Old wives' tales lingered stubbornly, and Lockwood, despite modern touches, remained a place where such stories settled comfortably. It was Ivy Halberton who found the body. The scream, thin and sharp as glass breaking, startled the crows from the yew trees before anyone fully understood what they'd heard. Miss Marple, moving with more speed than most credited her capable of, arrived at the bridge's mouth with Mrs. Fanshawe panting beside her. Young Ivy stood frozen at the threshold of the planks, one gloved hand pressed against her mouth. Her other arm trembled as she pointed. There, in the water. Oh, God, I didn't see. Mr. Clement, aghast but composed, stepped forward with a lantern hastily fetched from the vicarage. Its beam cut through the fog and settled on a shape caught against the bridge's underside supports, pale where skin met soaked fabric. It was unmistakably a man's body. The hat, still absurdly perched atop the sodden head, told Miss Marple, before anyone else managed to gasp his name. Mr. Vholes, she said quietly. Indeed it was. Lionel Vholes, the postmistress's husband, lay half submerged, his great frame rendered pitiful by water and death. His limbs floated slackly beneath the current's slow pull. There was confusion then, of course. Shouts for help, for someone to fetch the doctor, for ropes, for common sense. Mrs. Vowles arrived shrieking, restrained hastily by Reverend Pritchard and Mrs. Fanshawe. Ivy was led away, pale as her glass. The constable, a stout man named Rigby, with a fondness for rules but little experience in real tragedy, barked orders that sounded braver than he felt. Miss Marple stood very still. Mr. Clement, returning from his efforts with robe and lantern, paused beside her. His voice dropped. "Accident, do you suppose? Poor fellow, perhaps drunk again, fell, struck his head." She said nothing immediately. Her gaze traced the faint mark where the bridge rail bore fresh scuffing. A heel scraped in panic, a struggle. "I think, Mr. Clement," she said mildly, "we had better wait for the doctor's opinion." Dr. Braithwaite, summoned from his supper, arrived with the weary competence of a man who had seen too many sudden endings to treat any with surprise. He crouched by the body, frowning over bruises, wrist positions, the unnatural tilt of the neck. When he straightened, his verdict was quiet but firm. Neck broken. A fall, yes, but not a simple one. Mrs. Vowles had ceased wailing by then, sitting glassy-eyed with a cup of brandy between shaking hands. No one offered comfort beyond the perfunctory. The marriage had been strained, publicly so. Lionel's temper, Edith's nerves. It was known, in the way small villages know things without anyone needing to say them outright. Could be an accident, Rigby said doubtfully. Could be suicide. Could be something else. Miss Marple's lips pressed together. Rigby would follow procedure now. Statements, time of death estimates, a search of the area come daylight. Already the villagers whispered in little knots. Ivy Halberton's faintness. Mr. Clement's troubled frown. James Pettigrew, lingering oddly near the scene, though he had no cause to. Each absorbed in their own sudden shadows. She turned to Mrs. Fanshawe, who hovered at her elbow. "Dear Emily, would you see poor Mrs. Vowles home? This is no place for her." Of course, though I doubt she'll sleep tonight. Few of us shall." They moved away then, leaving the bridge to the constable's cordon and the doctor's weary notes. Miss Marple glanced back only once, her gaze fixing briefly on the scuffed railing, the place where darkness now lapped quietly at something torn loose and drifting, a scrap of cloth perhaps, or evidence, or merely riverweed playing tricks upon the eye. Still, she noted it. One always did at the beginning. Chapter 3. By the following morning, Lockwood had arranged itself neatly into two camps. Those who believed Lionel Vowles had been drunk and careless, and those who thought something darker had occurred beneath the covered bridge. Between them stretched a silence no one dared to break outright. Instead, whispers floated like smoke from cottage to cottage, curling through parlours and hedgerows alike. At the Red Fox, the village's only public house, the talk was brisk over teacups and pints alike. Mr. Pettigrew had taken to lingering there after breakfast, nursing a coffee he did not seem inclined to finish. His manner was distracted, his glances toward the window frequent. "I passed by that bridge not half an hour before," he told anyone within earshot, which presently included Mrs. Fanshawe's maid and the butcher's boy. "Didn't see a soul near it. Then again, it was getting on dusk. Could have missed something, I suppose." The maid clucked sympathetically. Poor Mrs. Vowles. And after she'd said only last week how she was thinking of moving to her sister's in Bath. Pettigrew shrugged, his fingers restless against the cup's handle. Might still, I shouldn't wonder. Nothing left to keep her here now. Meanwhile, Reverend Pritchard's wife had installed herself at the vicarage gates beneath the pretence of feeding birds, though her true occupation was observation. She noted everyone who passed and in what direction they went, filing it away beneath her neat bonnet. To her satisfaction, she saw Ivy Halberton heading toward Miss Marple's cottage just after 10, looking pale and drawn but determined. Miss Marple received her kindly, ushering her into the cool little sitting-room, where the scent of lavender water lingered beneath the faint trace of morning fire smoke. She poured tea with her usual precision, noting Ivy's bitten lip, her trembling fingers as she accepted the cup. "You needn't say anything you don't wish to, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, "but I expect you would feel better for it." Ivy gave a laugh that was not quite laughter. "Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't mean to find him. I wasn't looking for anyone. I only wanted a moment to myself, away from father's fussing, and James being, well, you know how people talk. There's fussing, and James being, well, you know how people talk. I only walked to the bridge because it was quiet." Miss Marple inclined her head without interruption. Ivy's gaze dropped to her untouched tea. "I thought I heard something, a splash, or footsteps, I can't really say, but when I looked down, he was there. I didn't know what to do. I screamed. It wasn't very brave, was it?" "Quite natural," Miss Marple assured her. "One doesn't expect such things on a peaceful evening." Ivy's hands twisted in her lap. "Father says I mustn't let people think I'm hysterical. He says these things reflect badly on a family. But I can't forget the way he looked. Mr. Vowles, I mean. His face. No, I shouldn't think you will forget that quickly. But tell me, my dear, had you noticed anyone near the bridge before, or even earlier in the day?" Ivy hesitated. "Only Mr. Pettigrew. He walked past me as I was leaving the fete. I thought it odd he didn't say good evening. He usually would. Looked distracted, like he had something unpleasant on his mind." Miss Marple's expression did not change. "And your father? Did he go near the bridge?" Ivy flushed. "Oh, no. Father was with Mr. Clement, talking about the Frick's accounts or some such. Everyone saw them." A small pause. "And Mrs. Vowles?" "She wasn't there. I think she'd gone home early. She'd been feeling poorly all week. Everyone said so." Miss Marple allowed the conversation to drift then, asking after Ivy's health, suggesting a tonic, a rest. Yet behind her kindly murmurs, she stored the girl's words precisely where they belonged, beside the mental map she was already assembling of that fatal twilight hour. When Ivy departed, some colour restored to her cheeks, Miss Marple sat a moment in silence. Through the window she could see the covered bridge in the distance, its timbers crouched beneath the weight of gossip and suspicion alike. The coroner's inquiry would come soon enough. But inquiries, in Miss Marple's view, often tidied away matters too briskly. It was observation that uncovered truths, not verdicts. And observation, in a village like Larkwood, required patience. Her next visitor proved less delicate. Mrs. Fanshawe arrived bearing currant buns and brisk opinions. "Well, I never thought much of Lionel Vowles," poor man though he is now. Always hovering at the edge of things, listening. Not the sort one trusts in a post office, if you ask me." Miss Marple smiled faintly. Yet trusted he was for many years. Too many. And Edith, too fluttery to manage him. Still, she's free now, I suppose. Though at what cost? Indeed. Did you hear whether he had any enemies? Beyond the domestic variety? Mrs. Fanshawe sniffed. In Lockwood, enemies are made of whispers, not weapons. Though I will say this, James Pettigrew owed him money, or so I've heard. Gambling debts from his London days. If I were casting about for motives, I'd start there. A quarrel, perhaps? No doubt. Pettigrew's not one to relish a debt hanging over him. Though how it leads to bodies beneath bridges, I couldn't say. Miss Marple said nothing. She had learned long ago that people often revealed more than they intended when they believed themselves merely speculating. When Mrs. Fanshawe left, the sitting-room seemed quieter for her absence. Miss Marple sipped her tea, cool now, and considered. Ivy Halberton's trembling, Pettigrew's odd silences, Mrs. Foles's retreat from society, threads in a pattern still forming, and always, beneath it, the covered bridge. She would walk there tomorrow, not for answers, perhaps, not yet, but for what the river might still remember. Chapter 4. The next morning dawned cool and pale, with a sky the colour of skimmed milk, and a hush over Lockwood that seemed deeper than usual, as if the village itself held its breath. Miss Marple, however, rose at her customary hour, selected a hat of modest proportions, and set out upon her usual walk with no deviation save for her route. She took the path by the mill-pond, then down through the spinney, where the ground dipped toward the river and the covered bridge. It was quieter here than in the village proper. No sound but the occasional bird call and the soft lapping of water against stone. The constable's cordon had been removed overnight. There was nothing further to disturb. No gawkers expected now that the body had been claimed, and the official verdict still pending. Miss Marple paused at the bridge's entrance, her gaze drifting along the timber uprights, noting the faint gouge upon the rail where something or someone had scraped in haste. She stepped carefully onto the boards, moving slowly, thoughtfully. At midpoint she paused again, peering down at the sluggish water below. A ribbon of torn cloth still hung caught upon a branch near the far support beam, fluttering faintly. She made note of it without sentiment. It was not the bridge alone that drew her gaze, but the banks beneath it. Uneven earth churned where feet might have slipped or struggled. Miss Marple's eye, accustomed to gardens and their secret pathways, traced the faint disturbance of moss and weed with quiet satisfaction. Someone had stood here. Someone had stepped hastily, slipped perhaps, or pushed. Her contemplation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps, slow, heavy. She turned, unsurprised to find Constable Rigby approaching with a notebook in hand and an expression of dutiful weariness. "Morning, Miss Marple. You've an eye for the place, I'll wager." "One does enjoy a constitutional," she replied mildly, "though I suppose such scenes aren't quite what I should choose." Rigby offered a faint smile. "No harm in looking. We've had the doctor's report. Nothing conclusive. Bruising suggests he was pushed, not fell, but there's no sign of a struggle anyone saw fit to mention. No witnesses, save Miss Ivy Halberton finding the body. Suspicious circumstances, yes. Proof of murder, no. And Mrs. Foles? At home, quiet as a mouse. Says she was resting with a headache at the time. No one disputes it, though I doubt she'll show her face much for a while. Poor woman. Miss Marple nodded, and Mr. Pettigrew. Rigby's brow furrowed. What of him? Only that he seemed. Rigby's brow furrowed. What of him? Only that he seemed unsettled yesterday. Rigby shrugged. Young man back from London. Debt to his name, reputation shaky at best. Rumours, you know how they grow here. Nothing solid. I've had a word with him. Says he'd no cause to quarrel with Vholes beyond the usual. Money, mostly. And Major Halberton. Oh, the Major's bark's worse than his bite. Talks loud, but says little of sense. Alibi's solid, with Mr. Clement, so many with nothing to hide, and yet someone has hidden something all the same, Miss Marple murmured. Rigby snorted. That's villages for you. She smiled. Indeed, they parted amicably enough. Rigby returning to his rounds, Miss Marple retracing her steps, with the air of one content to let time settle things into place. Yet, beneath her calm, thoughts shifted quietly. She stopped at the post office on her way home. Edith Vholes answered the door herself, thinner than Miss Marple remembered, her face drawn with a sleeplessness. Forgive the intrusion, Miss Marple said gently. I thought perhaps you might appreciate a little company. Or errands if there's need. Mrs. Vholes hesitated, then stepped aside. You're kind. I've been trying to keep busy, you understand. Sorting things. His things quite natural. The sitting room bore signs of this effort. Papers stacked, ledgers opened, a small box of envelopes tied with string. Miss Marple's gaze rested momentarily on these, before turning politely to her hostess. Lionel was troubled, I think. Mrs. Vholes gave a bitter little laugh. Troubled? Oh, yes. Debts drink tempers. Not to me, not often, but to others I warned him it would catch up with him one way or another. And did he confide any particular fear to you of late? No. A pause. Only he seemed quieter these past weeks, thoughtful, as if he were watching for something to happen. Had he enemies, Mrs. Vholes? A tired shrug. Not enemies you'd name. Only those he owed. Only those who'd had enough. Miss Marple sipped at the tea offered her, eyes resting upon the untidy bundle of correspondence. You've kept all his letters? Some. He wasn't much for writing. Bills mostly. A few from London, one or two from here. Miss Marple set down her cup with care. May I? Mrs. Vholes hesitated, then pushed the box toward her. If you wish. The letters were banal. Receipts, overdue notices, a curt demand from some solicitor's clerk. Only one stood out. A folded sheet without return address, typewritten, unsigned. Leave it alone. Some things aren't worth the price. Mrs. Vholes frowned at it. I'd forgotten that one. Came 2 weeks ago. Lionel laughed when he read it. Said it proved someone cared enough to threaten him at least. And did he say what he thought it meant? No. A shrug. But he did go to the bridge more often after that. Miss Marple smiled faintly, tucked the letter back beneath its string. Curious how warnings rarely arrive too early or too late, only just in time to be ignored. When she left, the mist was rising again from the river's bend, and the bridge stood silent beneath it. But Miss Marple thought, not silent for long. Chapter 5. By Thursday, the village of Lockwood had reached that peculiar stage in communal grief where sorrow thinned and speculation thickened. Conversations grew quieter when certain people passed by. Eyes shifted more often toward doors than windows. And somewhere beneath it all, the awareness lingered that someone amongst them had nudged Lionel Vowles toward his watery end. Miss Marple, known for her gentle tread and her sharper mind, moved through these currents with unobtrusive care. She visited the grocer for her usual items, exchanged pleasantries with Reverend Pritchard's wife beneath the hedgerow, and paused, quite by chance it seemed, at the green where Ivy Halberton sat, alone on a weathered bench beneath the chestnut tree. "Such a pleasant morning," Miss Marple said, settling beside her, "and yet I find people's faces so clouded these days." Ivy glanced at her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "It's difficult, carrying on as if nothing happened." "Yes, and yet one must. That's how villages work. The scandal we endure, the routine we maintain." Ivy gave a breath of something not quite laughter. "It feels wrong to sit here and speak of the weather." "Quite understandable, my dear. But sometimes it's in speaking of little things that larger truths emerge." Ivy hesitated. "Miss Marple, do you think it was murder?" Miss Marple took a moment to answer, her gaze on the clouds edging toward the river. "I think people are rarely pushed to their deaths for no reason, and even more rarely does such a push come from strangers." Ivy's hands tightened. "I didn't want to say it aloud, but I don't think Mr. Pettigrew is as harmless as he looks." "Oh, there was something between him and Mr. Vowles, not just money, something else." Miss Marple waited, the silence coaxing Ivy to fill it. "I heard them once, weeks ago, behind the churchyard, arguing. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but it was so loud. Mr. Vowles said something about the bridge and paying for mistakes. Mr. Pettigrew told him to shut his mouth before others heard." "How curious." Ivy nodded quickly, almost guiltily. "It frightened me. They both looked so angry afterward. I told no one. It wasn't my business, but now everything feels like your business. That's how tragedy works." Before Ivy could answer, footsteps approached. James Pettigrew himself, looking unusually grim beneath his rakish hat, paused at the sight of them. "Ladies." His nod to Miss Marple was courteous enough. To Ivy it was tinged with awkwardness. "May I?" Ivy made to rise. "I should go." "Nonsense," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "Do sit. We're all civilized people." Reluctantly, Ivy obeyed. Pettigrew took the bench's far end, smoothing his cuff as though gathering his thoughts beneath his sleeve. "Strange times," he said finally. "Stranger company." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, "though I find company, however strange, offers comfort in confusion." He gave her a sharp glance. "And do you find yourself confused, Miss Marple?" "Rarely, Mr. Pettigrew, but I do find myself curious." His mouth twisted. "About accidents at bridges?" Mouth twisted. "About accidents at bridges?" "About the patterns that bring people to bridges at certain hours, and about letters unsigned advising caution." Pettigrew stiffened, then recovered. "You've been speaking with Mrs. Vowles." One must speak to someone, and Mrs. Vowles seemed in need of kindness. He studied the path at his feet. Lionel Vowles had a knack for trouble. He liked to poke at things best left alone, such as debts. Pettigrew's laugh was short without humour. That certainly, and other people's secrets, he kept more than his own. And yet you paid him no heed. Another glance, sharper this time. "That's quite an assumption." "Oh, not at all. Observation, you see, one learns." Pettigrew rose abruptly. "I think this conversation's run its course." He left without waiting for farewell. Ivy watched him go, her face pale, "Does that prove anything?" she asked in a whisper. Miss Marple smiled. "Nothing. Yet." Later that day, Miss Marple found herself once again at the Red Fox, this time under the pretence of purchasing a jar of honey Mrs. Fanshawe had recommended. She exchanged pleasantries with the landlord, and noted without comment the quiet conversation occurring near the hearth between Major Halberton and Mr. Clement. "Ridiculous to suggest foul play," the Major was saying. "Man was a drunk, fell in, broke his neck, end of it." "Not so simple," Mr. Clement replied. "Doctor said as much. Doctors see shadows where there's none. Too many detective novels, I shouldn't wonder." Miss Marple took her honey and her leave, but not before noting the tightness in Mr. Clement's expression. Outside, she paused, considering. Major Halberton's bluster rang hollow. Mr. Clement's concern sounded genuine, and Pettigrew, well, his nerves spoke more loudly than his words. The question remained, what had Lionel Vowles known that made him linger near that bridge? What secret had he threatened to reveal? Back home, Miss Marple laid the unsigned letter upon her writing desk and considered its implications. Some things aren't worth the price, but someone had paid dearly already, and someone else might soon, if truth remained submerged. The covered bridge waited still, but Miss Marple thought it would not wait much longer. Chapter 6. By the week's end, the weather had shifted. A soft, persistent rain settled over Lockwood, blurring the outlines of cottages and hedgerows, turning paths to slick ribbons beneath cautious feet. To Miss Marple, who understood both gardens and human nature, it seemed a fitting accompaniment to the slow unfurling of secrets beneath the village's tidy exterior. She sat by her window with her knitting untouched beside her, and the unsigned letter from Lionel Vowles spread once more before her on the table. "Leave it alone. Some things aren't worth the price." The phrasing troubled her, not theatrical enough for blackmail, not overtly cruel. A warning, perhaps, but from whom? Someone afraid, or someone resentful? Her contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Clement himself, calling with an air of forced casualness beneath his rain-spotted hat. "Forgive the intrusion, Miss Marple. I wondered, that is, I thought you might appreciate some company on such a dreary afternoon." "How very kind! Do sit down. Tea?" He accepted, settling into the chair opposite, with a weariness she suspected owed less to the weather and more to the burden of village expectations. "I confess," he said after a moment, "this business with poor Vowles has unsettled me more than I care to admit. I've known deaths before, of course. Parish life brings one into frequent contact with grief, but this feels different. Because it is murder, you believe?" He blinked at her frankness, then gave a slow nod. "Yes, though I couldn't say why precisely. Instinct, perhaps, or observation." His smile was brief. "Perhaps I've been taking lessons from you, Miss Marple." She sipped her tea. "I think, Mr. Clement, you know more than you've permitted yourself to acknowledge. About Mr. Pettigrew, for example." The rector's expression stiffened. "What do you mean?" "That he owed money is common knowledge. That he argued with Lionel Vowles has become so by now. But there is something more. I wonder, did Mr. Vowles confide in you, or hint at some advantage he held over your young friend?" Mr. Clement hesitated. "He did come to me, yes. Not for spiritual counsel, I fear. For leverage. He wished to ensure I discouraged any inquiries into his affairs. He mentioned Pettigrew's debts, suggested there were letters he could produce if necessary, damaging ones. Letters from London days, gambling, associations with unsavoury sorts. Pettigrew's uncle, my predecessor here, secured his position by quiet arrangements. Vholes threatened to undo all that. He said the bridge was a fitting place for bargains, as it had always been a crossing between one side and another. How curious! And did you pass this on to Mr. Pettigrew? I warned him, yes. Advised him to settle matters peaceably. He assured me he intended to. Miss Marple's gaze softened. You believed him? I wanted to. A pause. Rain tapped gently at the glass. Do you think he killed Lionel Vholes? I think, Miss Marple said slowly, he is frightened. Whether of his own actions or of discovery remains to be seen. When Mr. Clement departed, she returned to the letter with fresh eyes. The bridge, a crossing between sides, between past and present, between what was owed and what could no longer be paid. That evening, as dusk pressed close once more, she took her walk not through the village, but down toward the river. The covered bridge loomed as ever, its timbers black against the misting rain. She paused beneath its shadow, listening, not for voices, but for silence itself. Footsteps disturbed that silence. Not hers, not Constable Rigby's, whom she had observed some minutes earlier, heading in the opposite direction. These were lighter, hesitant. James Pettigrew emerged from the gloom, his coat collar turned up against the wet, his expression wary. Miss Marple, Mr. Pettigrew, taking the air at this hour. One hears the river best when the village is quiet. He gave a short laugh. And what does the river say? Short laugh. And what does the river say? That truth rises, eventually. He leaned against the rail, fingers drumming. You think I killed him? I think you are troubled. He said nothing. The river moved beneath them, slow and implacable. Debts, he said at last. They cling to a man, you know. London debts follow you home, no matter how far you run. I owed Vholes more than money. I owed him my reputation, my future. He liked reminding me. And now he cannot. No. His voice was dull, but not by my hand. I thought of it. God help me, I thought of it because I didn't do it. Then who did? His gaze shifted to the far bank where the reeds shivered. Someone with more to lose than I. Such as? He hesitated. Ask the Major. Ask what secrets pass beneath this bridge. Before she could press him further, he was gone, swallowed by mist and rain. Miss Marple remained a pique-chaussee, moment longer, fingers resting upon the damp rail, where scratches still marked the wood. A bridge, after all, was not merely a place of crossing. It was a place where things might be left behind, or dragged beneath. She turned for home with her thoughts sharper than before. The Major, the letters, the debts, each a weight pulling against truth. And beneath it all, the slow pull of the river toward revelation. Chapter 7. The following morning brought clearer skies, though the air remained thick with the weight of things unsaid. Miss Marple, after her usual quiet breakfast and a few contemplative moments over her embroidery, decided the time had come to call upon Major Halberton directly. The Halbertons lived at Fern House, a property as loud in character as its owner. Ivy-choked walls, an iron gate prone to complaint, and a garden maintained more by accident than intention. Ivy Halberton herself answered the door, surprise flickering across her face before she composed it into politeness. Miss Marple, how unexpected! I wondered if your father might spare me a few minutes. He's in his study. I'll tell him." Miss Marple waited in the dim hallway, where ancestral portraits glared beneath decades of dust. Voices drifted faintly, one sharp with irritation, the other low with appeal. Then Ivy returned, ushering her into a room cluttered with papers, pipes, and the peculiar detritus of retired military men clinging to old campaigns. Major Halberton stood by the hearth, glass in hand, though it was barely noon. His manner was brisk, but his eyes were wary. "Miss Marple, to what do I owe this pleasure?" "Only curiosity, Major, and perhaps concern, about recent events, about Lionel Vowles." He made a noise of contempt. "Fool of a man, drank himself into trouble, and out again often enough. This time he didn't come up for air. An accident, then? More fool he, if so." Miss Marple smiled gently. "But you see, Major, accidents rarely leave behind unsigned letters, or bruises inconsistent with mere missteps." Halberton's fingers tightened on his glass. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "That perhaps Lionel Vowles's death was not only about debts or drunkenness. Perhaps it was about knowledge, secrets exchanged beneath bridges." The Major's gaze sharpened. "Who told you that?" "No one. One hears things, you know. And one wonders why a man like Vowles, with no great love for exercise, made so many visits to the river of late." Halberton snorted. "Looking for leverage, no doubt. He fancied himself a collector of weakness." "Indeed. And what did he collect from you, Major?" A pause, brief but telling. "Nothing worth mentioning. But something." The Major drained his glass. "Years ago, a foolish thing, a wager, cards, drink. I said something ill-advised about regimental funds, about how certain shortages might have been creatively explained. Nothing criminal, but embarrassing. Vowles overheard, threatened to revive it if I opposed him in his little schemes." "And did you oppose him? Publicly, number privately, often? Told him to go hang more than once, or fall from a bridge?" Halberton's glare returned. "I didn't kill him." "No," Miss Marple said mildly. "I don't believe you did. But someone knew of his habits. Someone knew who might be vulnerable if Vowles chose to speak." He set down his glass with more force than necessary. "If you're suggesting Ivy, oh no. Poor child has secrets of her own, I dare say, but not murder." "I wonder, Major, did Vowles mention anyone else he'd spoken to? Anyone else he might have pressured?" The Major's jaw worked. "Pettigrew, of course, and Clement, though that was more spiritual than financial. Vowles liked to poke at the cracks in men's armor." "And women's?" Halberton hesitated. "I heard, though only hearsay, that Edith Vowles had begun visiting the bridge herself. After dark. Perhaps following her husband. Perhaps meeting someone else." "How interesting. And you never thought to mention this to Constable Rigby?" "What would it serve? The woman's half mad with grief." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Grief often masks other emotions, Major, fear among them." She took her leave then, with civility and a mind busier than ever. Outside, Ivy caught her at the gate, breathless. "Miss Marple, what did he say?" "Only what I expected, my dear." "And about me? You have nothing to fear from me, Ivy." "Nor, I think, from your father's secrets. But I would be careful where you walk alone." Ivy's face paled. Do you think it's not over?" "I think such things rarely end with a body in a river. They end with truth uncovered, and truth is still waiting." Back in her cottage, Miss Marple sat again before the unsigned letter. Secrets passed beneath bridges. Who had written it? Not Pettigrew, whose panic was too fresh. Not the Major, whose pride would never stoop to typewritten warnings. Mrs. Vowles herself. Possible. A woman driven to desperation might attempt to save her husband, or herself. And what of Reverend Pritchard's wife, that keen observer of comings and goings? A woman who disliked mess and feared scandal above all. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Some things aren't worth the price. Unless, of course, one paid dearly to keep them hidden. The village still whispered of accidents. But Miss Marple heard something else beneath those whispers. Threads of guilt tugging at seams grown too frayed to hold. Tomorrow, she thought, would bring another unravelling. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's thoughts the next morning turned, as they often did in such cases, to the matter of patterns. How people revealed themselves not through their words, but through the repetitions they believed no one noticed. A man's steps always took him to the same place at the same hour. A woman's glances lingered too long on windows she swore she did not watch. The village's gossip circled in patterns too, revealing beneath its petty chatter the deeper lines of fear, resentment, and guilt. With this in mind, she set out not toward the bridge, but toward the vicarage, where Mrs. Pritchard was known to conduct her own private surveillance of Lockwood, from beneath the guise of needlepoint and charity. Mrs. Pritchard received her with a certain briskness that masked poorly the tension beneath. "You've come about the bridge, of course. Everyone does, though no one says so directly." "Only to inquire how things stand," Miss Marple replied mildly. "One hears so much, and clarity is often in short supply." Mrs. Pritchard poured tea with sharp movements. "People will talk no matter what's said. They'll tie up the poor man's death in ribbons of scandal and suspicion until it barely resembles the truth. Indeed, and yet one wonders who benefits from such confusion. Not the widow, surely. She's hardly fit to know her own mind, poor creature." Mrs. Pritchard's lips thinned. "Though I suppose some would say grief dulls the memory. Conveniently. A curious remark. Is it? I've long thought Edith Vowles too fragile to weather such storms unaided. But she had friends of sorts, people who looked in on her, who whispered things, perhaps, who promised to fix matters before they grew beyond control. Such as Mr. Vowles himself." Mrs. Pritchard's glance sharpened. "Hardly. Lionel Vowles caused more storms than he calmed." "Then who, I wonder?" The vicar's wife returned to her tea, refusing to answer directly. But Miss Marple had what she came for, not information, but confirmation. Mrs. Pritchard knew something. Whether through observation or involvement remained to be seen. She left the vicarage with a mind turning over new possibilities. Secrets exchanged in dark corners, threats softened by polite tones. And somewhere within it, a woman too weak to protect herself, and a husband who would use that weakness to his advantage. On her way back through the village, she encountered Edith Vowles emerging from the greengrocer's, her face pale, her movements hesitant. "Mrs. Vowles, how good to see you out." "Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't expect, I was just doing quite rightly in tending to small necessities. Life must go on after all." Edith gave a strained smile. "So they say. If you've a moment, I might walk with you. There's something I've been wondering." They moved together toward the quieter lanes, away from curious eyes. "You mentioned before Lionel's visits to the bridge Did he say why, or whom he expected to meet? No, he wasn't one for sharing his thoughts. Only once he said something about settling old accounts, about finishing things before they finished him. A tremor passed through her voice. He frightened me, Miss Marple. Toward the end, he frightened me more than he ever had before. Did he ever speak of Mrs. Pritchard? Mrs. Pritchard? No. Why should he? Perhaps because she, too, values discretion, because she, too, understands how small villages thrive on what remains unspoken. I don't know. I really don't. Miss Marple touched her arm lightly. Forgive me. It is not my intention to trouble you further. Only to understand, so that others might be spared such misunderstandings. They parted at the gate to Mrs. Vholes's cottage, where curtains still twitched at imagined scandals. That afternoon brought a summons of sorts from Constable Rigby, who arrived at Miss Marple's door with an expression of mild embarrassment. Thought you ought to know, Miss Marple. We found something by the bridge. Oh, a button, broken clean away, it looks like, embedded near the supports. Not Vholes's, too fine for that. Gentleman's coat, we think. Could be nothing, could be something. Curious, and who in Lockwood might wear such a coat? Rigby grimaced. Pettigrew, perhaps, or the Major. Hard to say. Tailoring's not what it was. And Mrs. Vholes's husband. Woolens and cheap cloth, not his style. Then we are left with questions as ever. Rigby nodded. Thought you'd like to know, before the rumours catch up. After he left, Miss Marple sat quietly with her knitting, letting the pattern form beneath her fingers, even as her thoughts wove something more intricate. A button beneath the bridge. A letter without a name. Debts unpaid, secrets half revealed, and always the bridge standing between what was known and what was feared. Not long now, she thought. Patterns reveal themselves in the end, and some threads cannot hold forever. Chapter 9. The discovery of the button, though small in itself, shifted something within the village's uneasy equilibrium. Gossip moved from the general, an accident surely, to the pointed. Names were spoken more freely now, and in quieter tones. Pettigrew, the Major, even Reverend Pritchard, though no one could quite say why. Miss Marple, as ever, allowed the murmurs to swirl untouched around her, preferring instead to observe how people adjusted beneath suspicion. It was not fear alone that shaped behaviour. It was guilt, shame, the desperate instinct to preserve one's place in the village hierarchy. She returned once more to Fern House, where she found Ivy Halberton at the garden gate, her face pale beneath a sun hat far too summery for the grey skies. "You heard about the button, I suppose?" Ivy said without greeting. "I had it from Constable Rigby. A curious find. Father's worried. He won't say so, but I can see it. His coat, he sent it out to be mended this week. Said it caught on something. Said it was nothing, but now it's something." Ivy's hands twisted at her. Gloves. He couldn't, I believe your father capable of many things, my dear, but murder is not among them. Rashness, temper, pride, yes, but not cold blood. Ivy's relief was fragile. Then who? Pettigrew. He's desperate enough. Desperation leads to foolishness, not always to violence. Tell me, Ivy, did you ever see your father meet with Lionel Vholes at the bridge, or anyone else? No, but I heard him argue with someone, not Mr. Vholes, a woman, late one night after the fete. I thought it was Mrs. Voles, but now I'm not so sure. Not sure. She was crying, angry too. Said something about ruining everything if she didn't stop. I didn't want to listen, but you hear things in this house. Indeed. Miss Marple left Ivy with her worries, and walked slowly toward the village green, where Mrs. Fanshawe intercepted her with the brisk energy of those who believe efficiency a cure for scandal. Miss Marple, I do wish you'd speak to Edith Voles. The poor woman's become, well, strange. Wandering at odd hours, talking to herself. People will talk, and worse, they'll imagine. They already do. All the more reason for someone sensible to take her in hand. Miss Marple smiled faintly. I shall see what can be done. She found Mrs. Voles in the churchyard, staring at the river beyond the gravestones. The widow's appearance had deteriorated, her hair untidy, her gloves mismatched. Yet her gaze, when it met Miss Marple's, was oddly clear. You've come to ask what I know. If you're willing to tell me. I should have told you sooner. Edith's voice was thin but steady. It wasn't Lionel who frightened me most. It was what he knew, what he threatened to tell. About the Major, about others, about Mrs. Pritchard. Miss Marple's expression remained mild. How curious. They had secrets, affairs, debts, things better buried. Lionel wasn't careful. He liked knowing things. He liked making people sweat. And so someone made sure he would not speak again. I didn't see it, but I heard footsteps that night. A struggle. A voice I didn't recognize, not clearly, not until later. And who, Mrs. Voles, did you recognize? Edith's hands clenched. Margaret Pritchard. I heard her again yesterday, speaking with Ivy's father. Same tone, same threats. A woman of principle, Miss Marple said softly, and principles defended too fiercely often lead to folly. She wrote the letter. I'm sure of it now. That remains to be seen. But thank you, Mrs. Voles. You've helped more than you know. Miss Marple left her there, beneath the yew trees, and made her way not to the vicarage, but to Constable Rigby's modest office, where she laid her observations before him with characteristic delicacy. I think, Constable, that Mrs. Pritchard might enlighten us on several matters. The letter, for one, the whereabouts of certain buttons, for another. Rigby frowned. You're saying, I am saying only this. Motives are rarely found in pockets alone, but threads often lead somewhere, if one is patient. That evening, as mist gathered once more at the river's edge, Miss Marple sat by her window with her knitting, and considered how neatly some patterns began to unravel when pulled just so. Not long now, she thought. Not long at all. Chapter 10. Miss Marple did not sleep much that night. It wasn't worry. At her age, worry gave way to clarity, or it became useless. Rather, it was a sense that the puzzle had offered up its edges, and now she only had to place the remaining pieces. The bridge, the threats, the button, the letter. And now, Edith Voles's memory of a voice, clearer now, clearer still. By mid-morning, Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage, not bothering with subtlety. She was received by Reverend Pritchard himself, who looked mildly startled to see her on the doorstep. My wife is out at the school board meeting, Miss Marple, he said, but I'd be glad of your company if I may offer it. I think, dear Reverend, that it's your wife I must speak with. Perhaps you might advise her to join me for tea later today. He blinked, uncertain. Is there concern? Not yet, Miss Marple said kindly, but it may become necessary. Mrs. Pritchard arrived just after 4. her presence composed but coiled, like a tightly wound watch, functioning perfectly and entirely unnatural. "You've been quite active of late, Miss Marple," she said as she removed her gloves. "A talent for unearthing things best left undisturbed." "I merely knit," Miss Marple replied, "and sometimes observe." "And what have you observed now?" "That Lionel Vowles was blackmailing more than one person in this village. That he'd collected secrets like a child collects marbles, only far less innocently." Mrs. Pritchard sipped her tea. "And you think I had something to hide?" "Not in the usual sense, but I believe he threatens something you value above reputation, order. He sowed disorder with his knowledge, his threats, and his disdain for boundaries. You feared what might unravel if he spoke to the wrong person." Mrs. Pritchard's composure slipped, only briefly. Her teacup rattled against the saucer before she steadied it. "He sent a letter," Miss Marple went on, "typed, unsigned. I believe you wrote it. A warning, not from fear, but from frustration. A desperate attempt to preserve what you considered moral balance. But he ignored it, of course. He enjoyed crossing lines." "I warned him," Mrs. Pritchard whispered. "I told him to stop, that he was meddling in people's lives, that he'd tip this village into shame and scandal. And when he didn't stop—" Mrs. Pritchard didn't answer. Not directly. She stared into her cup. "He thought he was untouchable. He knew about the Major's misconduct, about James Pettigrew's debts, about things I'd overheard in confidence, even things I never told my husband." "Did you go to the bridge that night?" A pause. "I followed him. I only meant to speak to him again, to make him see." "And did he?" Her eyes flicked up. "He laughed at me. Said I'd always look down my nose at others, but had just as much to hide. Said perhaps he'd start whispering things about me next." "What happened then?" "I grabbed his coat. To stop him from walking away. He pulled back. To stop him from walking away. He pulled back. There was mud, a slip. He stumbled against the rail. I let go too late." Silence settled for a moment. Miss Marple stirred her tea. "And the button?" "It tore loose in my hand. I didn't realize until I was home. I burned the coat I've worn, the gloves, but I kept the button. I couldn't throw it away." "You returned the next night," Miss Marple said gently, "to place the letter, to shift attention." Mrs. Pritchard nodded slowly. "It wasn't murder, Miss Marple. It was a moment, a slip, but I knew no one would believe that. Number they might not have, but I might." A long pause. The air between them held more than words. "And now?" Mrs. Pritchard asked. "Now I believe we must speak to Constable Rigby. He will ask questions, and you must answer them, truthfully, completely." Mrs. Pritchard stood. She did not cry, she did not protest. But the lines in her face seemed deeper as she stepped toward the door. Before she left, Miss Marple said quietly, "You are not a wicked woman, but you forgot something. Order imposed from fear is never as strong as understanding born of truth." Mrs. Pritchard did not reply. Later that evening, the village hummed with quiet revelation. Word spread, not as scandal, but as confirmation. The official report would frame it as involuntary manslaughter, a confrontation gone tragically wrong. Mrs. Pritchard confessed to her part, spared others their shame, and asked no leniency. The bridge remained, weathered and silent, but no longer mysterious. Miss Marple, watching dusk fall, thought not of guilt but of balance. Lionel Vowles had upset it. Others had tried to restore it. In the end, as always, truth had done the job itself. Chapter 11. It was 2 days after Mrs. Pritchard's quiet confession that Miss Marple found herself once again seated in the modest drawing-room of Constable Rigby's office. Rain dusted the windows, and the clock above the fireplace ticked in time with the constable's pen as he finished noting the last lines of the report. "She never intended to kill him," he said, voice low, as if afraid to disturb the balance now achieved. "That much is clear, but the law, well, the law must still account for the loss of a life." Miss Marple gave a slight nod. "And the truth must be given its full weight, even if it comes wrapped in tragedy." Rigby set down his pen. "It's the kind of case they'll forget in a few years. A line in the paper, a paragraph in the archives. But it shook Lockwood. It reminded people how fragile their peace really is. Which is precisely why it mattered." She rose slowly, eyes drifting to the rain-smeared window. Outside, the covered bridge stood as it always had, humble, weathered, watching. She turned back to Rigby with the quiet calm she wore like a shawl. "I suppose," he said after a moment, "you saw it all much earlier than the rest of us." Miss Marple smiled. "No, not all at once. But things began to settle into place. First, the nature of the death itself. It lacked the hallmarks of premeditation. The body had no defensive wounds, no long struggle. The fall was abrupt. It spoke of panic, not planning." Rigby nodded. "And the letter?" "That told me more than perhaps it should have. Its tone, measured, restrained, more moral than fearful, wasn't the cry of a desperate debtor or a furious rival. It sounded like someone who believed they were preserving decency. That narrowed it." She gave a pause. "Mrs. Pritchard writes frequently, of course. The church newsletters, the school circulars, and she uses the same old Remington typewriter, just slightly off-center on the S. The letter bore that same quirk. You notice that?" "I make no claims to special sight, Constable. Only habit. One sees how people reveal themselves when they don't realize they're speaking. And the button? A mistake, a trace of impulse. If Mrs. Pritchard had truly meant to kill Lionel Foles, she would have done so without coming into physical contact. No, the button slipping from her hand, the torn coat, these were signs of a confrontation that spiraled beyond her control." Rigby shook his head slowly. "And no one suspected her?" "Not really. That is often the way. We assume guilt wears a scowl or shouts in public, but sometimes it sits at committee meetings, correcting hymn selections, believing itself blameless until the very end." He smiled faintly at that. "You ought to write a book." "Dear me, no. I prefer my roses and a good cup of tea, and occasionally the truth." That evening, Miss Marple sat in her small front room with Reverend Clement and Mrs. Fanshawe, both of whom had arrived under the guise of checking on her health, but in truth were craving resolution. "I still can't quite believe it," Mrs. Fanshawe said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Margaret Pritchard, of all people." "She did what she thought necessary," said the Reverend quietly. "But even righteousness can turn cruel when twisted by fear." "Do you believe she truly meant only to stop him?" Miss Marple stirred her tea. "Yes, I do. But intention cannot always protect us from consequence. That's the lesson here." There was a pause. Outside, the wind stirred the hedgerows. "She'll go before the magistrate," Reverend Clement added, "but with the truth laid bare, The court may show some mercy." Mrs. Fanshawe sighed. "And the village?" Miss Marple looked toward the hearth, where the fire had gone low. "It will return to its routines. Villages always do, but it will remember, quietly." In the days that followed, Lockwood did just that. The Fed's leftover bunting was finally taken down. The bridge was scrubbed and painted again, perhaps as an act of denial, or maybe of closure. Edith Voles left to stay with her sister in Bath. James Pettigrew resumed his walks, but now avoided the river path altogether. Ivy Halberton took to visiting Miss Marple more often, and her face began to show signs of peace. Major Halberton, for his part, grew more silent, less bluster. Perhaps he'd realize how easily things slip from a man's grasp when he's too proud to see what's festering underneath. Constable Rigby submitted his report, the typewritten pages neat and complete. The official record would show a fall, a confrontation, and an unintentional death. But Miss Marple knew better. The truth, in her mind, was not just in how Lionel Voles had died, but in how he'd lived, stirring bitterness, tugging on threads until the fabric gave way. He had underestimated the power of secrets and the danger of wielding them without caution. He had made himself too valuable to be ignored and too toxic to be tolerated. And when he'd pushed too far, he'd slipped, quite literally. Miss Marple walked to the bridge once more that week, alone, just after morning rain. The planks were still damp, the railings cold to the touch. She paused at the center, looked down at the slow-moving river. It remembered. It always did, and so did she. Chapter 12. Autumn came early to Lockwood that year, the air sharpened by mid-September, and leaves began their slow golden surrender to the earth. Life, so recently disturbed, resumed its rhythm, if not with joy, then with a kind of weary steadiness. The covered bridge still stood, quietly enduring. Fresh white paint masked the memory of what had happened there, could not the echo. And echoes, Miss Marple knew, never truly faded. They simply retreated into corners, waiting to be noticed again. She was returning from the market, carrying her small basket of tea biscuits and apples, when she passed Constable Rigby outside the post office. He tipped his cap and called her name. "Miss Marple, hold on. Just had something come through this morning." She paused beside him on the walk, curious. "Letter from the magistrate's office, about Mrs. Pritchard." He lowered his voice. "She won't serve prison time. Suspended sentence, psychiatric evaluation, some counselling in the county. Her husband's taken leave from the parish. They're going to stay with relatives in Wiltshire." "A measured response," Miss Marple said. "Compassion balanced by understanding. Quite right." Rigby nodded. "Still, strange how it all turned. That a woman like her, well, you saw it before the rest of us." She smiled, thin and kind. "Only because I've seen too many people like her, the ones who keep order so tightly they forget the cost." He hesitated. "I meant to say, there was a letter from Mrs. Pritchard, addressed to you." "Indeed?" "She asked that it be passed along once the court issued its decision." He handed it over, a single folded sheet, thin cream paper, no return address. Miss Marple tucked it into her basket and gave him a nod. "Thank you, Constable. I'll read it in the quiet." She did so that evening, seated beside the fireplace, the same way she always read letters, with care, patience, and a willingness to understand the writer more than the words. Miss Marple. By the time this reaches you, my part in this will be properly recorded, reduced to dates and consequences. But I must thank you, not for uncovering the truth, but for doing so gently. You were correct. I did not intend harm, but I did want silence, and I let that desire blind me to the weight of my hands. There is one last thing. I never meant for Edith to suffer as she has. She deserved kindness. We all did once. Please, if she should ever ask, tell her the truth, that I tried to stop him and failed. Not out of cruelty, but fear. Yours sincerely, Monsieur Pritchard. Miss Marple folded the letter and placed it inside a drawer, alongside other memories, some solved, some simply endured. In the following days, the village settled again into its rituals. Edith Vowles, quiet as ever, returned briefly to collect a final trunk of belongings. Miss Marple met her at the gate. They've left the vicarage, Edith said softly. Gone away. Yes, for some time, I imagine. Edith's eyes were rimmed with tiredness, but she no longer seemed fragile. There was something steadier in her now, grief giving way to resolve. I always thought Margaret Pritchard was the strongest woman in the village, she said. Now I wonder if any of us ever really knew her. She was strong, Miss Marple replied, but strength, like anything, becomes brittle if stretched too far. Edith was silent a moment. And Lionel? Lionel chose to gamble with secrets. He forgot that even a whisper can tip a life over the edge. A pause. Did she hate him? No, Miss Marple said gently. She feared what he might cause. That's a different kind of danger. Edith nodded. I'm going to Bath, to begin again. Write when you can. I will. They said no more. There was nothing left to untangle. The final confirmation came not from confession, or the letter, or the court, but from silence. The village, having survived its scandal, spoke less of the bridge, less of Lionel Vowles, and almost nothing of Mrs. Pritchard. And yet, small acknowledgments crept into daily life. Reverend Clement preached more gently, with fewer declarations and more questions. Major Halberton spoke less loudly at the pub. Even Pettigrew, no longer the subject of gossip, began tutoring local children in the evenings, his arrogance softened by something close to humility. Miss Marple continued her walks, her tea, and her quiet observations. One afternoon, Ivy Halberton joined her in the garden with 2 cups and a fresh tin of shortbread. It feels like everything's changed, Ivy said, settling in beside her. It always does, Miss Marple replied. And yet the roses still bloom, and the milk still arrives. Life persists. Ivy turned to her. You never said how you knew. Miss Marple considered, then said gently, because she hesitated. Hesitated? When I asked her a simple question, what Lionel Vowles had said that frightened her most, she didn't mention anything concrete. She described emotion, guilt. That is rarely the response of someone uninvolved. Guilt has a tone. Ivy looked down at her tea. Will you ever stop noticing everything? Miss Marple smiled. Only when people stop giving themselves away. And so the story of the covered bridge reached its end, not in spectacle, but in understanding. The mystery was solved. The guilty had spoken. The village returned, not to innocence, but to something quieter. A hard-won peace. And beneath it all, the river moved on, carrying the past toward the sea, slow and silent like memory.